Hey, welcome to another exciting episode of the Give Me Liberty podcast, and I'm joined by historian and friend, author, Dr. Mark David Hall. He is no stranger to Liberty University, the Standing for Freedom Center, or this podcast. We've had him on numerous times as guest. I think it's really important as we look into the question of our national identity, as we think about the history of this country as it pertains to our Christian faith. We ask the question today, what is exactly Christian nationalism? I'm bringing him on as an expert to answer that for us. All of this on the Give Me Liberty podcast, starting now. Welcome back to the Give Me Liberty podcast, and I'm joined by special guest and friend, Dr. Mark David Hall. Mark, can I call you Mark for the sake of the podcast? We've been friends for several years now. Mark has been at Liberty University, has lectured here for our students. He's been at several of our conferences that we've had in the past. And you've written several research papers for the Freedom Center. And I just want to point out, not only are you at George Fox University, but congratulations, Madison program there at Princeton University with Robert P. George, another favorite of ours. And the question today, and the reason I wanted to have you on, and I think this is so important, is answering the question, what is Christian nationalism? I think you could probably prove all of this for us in a matter of minutes, but I also know that these are conversations that we have to continue to have, and we have to shape our own understanding by being informed, honestly, historically, and even in the contemporary. But what is Christian nationalism?
You know, prior to 2006, no one was speaking about Christian nationalism as the term is being used today. You know, back in the 90s and early 21st century, people were complaining about the religious right or the Christian right. But that's morphed into this entity called Christian nationalism. Now, most of the literature on this topic is just horrible. It's written by polemicists, people employed by the Freedom from Religion Foundation and folks like that who just paint it as this horrible, scary monster. Sexist, racist, homophobic, the whole nine yards. A bunch of theocrats who want to turn America into a handmaiden's tale. And so if you read this literature, you'd say, well, of course I don't like that. Who would possibly like that? But none of this is really describing pretty much any Christian I know, literally any Christian. I run in conservative Christian circles, evangelical circles, all the time. Now, more recently, there have been a few books by sociologists and one very recently by Paul Miller that are more sensible, that make a good faith effort to understand what Christian nationalism is. But still, these folks basically define it as a conflation of God and country, Christians worshiping the United States of America and wanting to oppress everyone else. So again, we still would have to say, no, I don't like that. This literature is just horrible. We can maybe chat about it a bit more. There is, of course, an understanding of Christian nationalism that we should embrace, one that says nation states are important. We live in a global order comprised of nations, and we should be glad that we have the United States of America. The French should be glad they have France, the Spanish, Spain, and so forth. And so this recognition of the importance of nationalism is not to say America is better than all the other countries. It's to say nations are good. We should be proud of our nation. We should be willing to sacrifice for our nation. And then the Christian element might get into Christians bringing their faith into the public square to advocate for Christian positions, the end of abortion, religious liberty for all, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's this sense in which every generation has that process of what they believe to be original discovery, right? And it's really just, we call it navel gazing, but just kind of like stumble upon the obvious, but with a sense of original discovery. I can't remember who said that originally. I've heard that many times. I think it was probably George Will that I picked that up from one time. But just this idea that, eureka, this moment, that there are all kinds of nationalities. Every nation has its own set of laws. It has to have borders, boundaries, compacts, right? And its own common understanding of identity. You know, what are we? You know, we are Germans, we are French, we are whatever. Even in modern day Turkey, there's a common sense of understanding of the Ottoman Empire and its vast stretch that went all the way down to North Africa, all the way up to Vienna at one point. And then they had all kinds of social reforms. But there has to be an understanding of who we are as a common people. And in the United States, Christianity made so much of that. And even in particular, a lot of people say Judeo-Christian. Well, yes, in so much as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob in the Old Testament, and obviously Jesus Christ, who unites all of human history at the point of not only his his birth, but his death, burial, and resurrection. Right, all of human history and all of human events. That is the single focus that unites history, both past, present, future. And the reality is that we as a culture, when we started as a nation, we were a Protestant nation. We weren't just a Christian nation, we were a Protestant nation. We were a nation that understood righteous resistance to tyranny, and all of our laws were defined as such. And I mean, we really did have a rich 400 or 500 year history going back to the Reformation, but then built upon all of those people coming before, all of the great thinkers. So anyway, what if you don't have nationalism and you don't have Christian nationalism, then what do you have? I think that's the other question.
Yeah, well, a couple of options. One would be anarchy, right? We just don't have a nation state. We live in a territory that is what we now call the United States of America, but we're a bunch of different clans. I don't think anyone thinks that's a great idea. The other possibility, of course, is empire. Instead of a nation state, we have an empire. The United States takes over Mexico and Canada and Taiwan or whatever else, and we'll have this empire just like the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire. I don't think anyone thinks this is a good idea. Empires never really work out well for anyone other than the main people, the Romans or the Greeks, for instance. Let me make a distinction. There are some people who define nationalism by definition. Nationalism is illiberal.
Right.
I suppose if you accept that definition, you have to reject nationalism. Right. Now, these people will always hasten to say, but patriotism is okay. So I'm a patriotic American, just not a national. Well, fine, you can do that if you want. I think the way in which you're using nationalism is really synonymous with patriotism, right? We love our country. We think our country's important. Our country certainly is not God. We're not going to worship our country. Aren't going to conflate God and country. If, heaven forbid, one day the United States started ordering its people to disobey God, we would obey God rather than man, right? So there's a proper sense of nationalism versus this conflated sense of nationalism that I'm not really sure anyone embraces. I think it's a straw man that people set up to knock down.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I want to talk a little bit more even about that, because I think in the contemporary, even among Christians, and it is very popular to speak in such a way that, Jesus is for all the globalists, in a way, Jesus was a globalist. Well, no, I mean, define globalism. And when you think about empire, kind of the way, you say, well, we could have this kind of tribal or sort of balkanized, fracturing, kind of like Afghanistan is not really a country; it's a region filled with tribal groups, right? Right. But that map was drawn up I guess at the end of World War I, and so you either have tribal or you have empire, and the reality is that globalists today are actually empire. That's really kind of how when you talk about supranationalism. You're really talking about what? There's going to be a supreme authority. Who is it? Is it Davos? Is it Klaus Schwab? Is it Xi Jinping? Who is it? And, so there is going to be an authority. I would rather that authority be local. And I would rather that authority be local and representative. I wouldn't want that authority to be foreign and absolute. And many people throughout history have lived that way.
And let me make an observation, which I know you know. I think globalists all assume that the final authority will be basically liberal Democrats, right? Liberal here in the sense of Lockean liberal. But the vast majority of the world rejects those values. So if we had a global government representative of the world, it would be a very authoritarian structure where our rights as we know them would not be well respected at all.
Yeah, that's right. And so break it down. I mean, this is some argument you've written on this more recently. There have been books that have been kind of have come out on both sides. I think Paul Miller, Yoram Hazony. there's been some other books talking about this issue with regards to nationalism. I believe in a classic liberal society. I don't actually think that classic liberalism is a natural descendant of secularism. I believe it's one that you have to assume some common moral understanding, and I think it has to be Christian. I don't see how, absent of Christianity, you get liberal democracies.
Yeah, so here's how I would characterize the literature. So the vast majority of it is written by polemicists, and they have no interest in truth. Recently, there have been a few works by sociologists, Whitehead and Perry, Gorski and Perry, where they make an attempt to measure Christian nationalists. And I think it's a good faith attempt, but it's just horribly flawed. And they import all sorts of values into it, sexist, racism, so forth and so on. Paul Miller really is the exception. He's the only conservative Christian who has written extensively on Christian nationalism. And so it's really an insider critique, and he's open about that. He's writing openly as a Christian. He sees this phenomenon which he dislikes. Now, one of the problems that Paul Miller has is almost no one actually calls himself a Christian nationalist. So he critiques Harzoni, Bigger, and folks like this. Harzoni's Jewish. He lives in Israel, right? Bigger's British. None of these folks call themselves Christian nationalists. And so basically Miller has to import things into their argument. Now, these are all advocates of nationalism, and they recognize that culture is important, but I don't think in any identifiable sense they're Christian nationalists. And so I've been very critical of this literature, but I'm actually co-authoring a book when I'm at Princeton on Christian nationalism. And what I hope to do is identify it, and then identify the ways in which it's manifested itself throughout American history. Sometimes these are ugly ways. I think Manifest Destiny in the 19th century and our treatment of Native American tribes can be seen as a manifestation of Christian nationalism, and we should critique that, right?
Yeah.
But that sort of evil understanding of Christian nationalism has largely gone away. And so today what people are calling Christian nationalists are Christians who fight in the public square to end abortion or to promote religious liberty and that sort of thing. And so I think it's a very unhelpful label for those of us who are advocating for these sorts of things.
Yeah, very, very well said. I mean, I think that even more recently, with our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the fact that we were there for 20 years, and it was largely something that was run by the Pentagon and the State Department. I think most Americans were probably oblivious to what was happening there. You think about the tribal identity of most people there, and you think about too in terms of the social and human experiments, and when I think about social engineering, if you will, probably in the worst way possible, where we're trying to plant democracies around the world, but what's their common understanding? How do you get a liberal democracy in Afghanistan, for example? It doesn't work. And so you see the failure there, and it's a failure to understand what really undergirds the pillars of a free society that need to be there, the fundaments, if you will. And then you take, for example, we're seeing this play out in Ukraine, which, a former vassal state of the USSR, and you think about the ambitions of Putin, but there's been a lot of misinformation about what's going on there. But arguments of nationalism come out of that. So people that would not support nationalism here in the United States all of a sudden are saying, oh, the sovereign state of Ukraine has been invaded. I agree. I agree with that. But yet, at the same time, a total blind eye to the southern border and to our own national sovereignty here in the United States, even laws of govern our economics and everything else, that they want to sign all kinds of trade documents and multilateral agreements on climate change and everything else in order to give up that sovereignty. So there's a whole bunch of confusion, if you will, on the issue of, prioritizing. I think about America first. You have to be careful with what that actually means, and what even Germany said when they put themselves first, for example, during World War II. Not the same meaning at all, not the same intentionality, but certainly nationalism is an important thing to get right.
And this is, probably why it's best, as you know, to avoid labels. So I don't call myself a Christian nationalist. I don't say America first. I said, look, let's just sit down and have a discussion about the issues. What should be our policy toward abortion? What should be our policy towards immigration? Like almost everyone who's looked at this, I think our immigration system is fundamentally broken. We need to fix it. We need to make it easier to immigrate legally to the United States of America, and yet to stop illegal immigration. We can have a discussion about that without throwing around labels and this sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, the road forward as a country, I see the disintegration of many things that keeps us as a nation strong. There has to be some kind of singular identity, e pluribus unum, out of many one. So, what makes us essentially American and not something else, and not just citizens of the world? We're citizens of the United States of America. What makes us unique?
I think at this point of history, the best possible answer are the basic principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think that's something we can all agree on, right? Christians, atheists, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs. It can't be religion anymore, right? 37% of Americans don't identify themselves as Christians. Maybe in 1776, that was a possibility, where Americans of European descent, 98% Protestant, 2% Roman Catholic. That might have been something that held us together then. I don't think it can nowadays. Now, as a Christian, of course, I pray for revival. I pray these 37%
Yes.
who don't identify as Christians will become Christians. That would be wonderful, right? But barring that happening, we have to have something else that connects us. And I think these basic principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, which most Americans continue to hold, right, regardless of race, gender, religion. I think that's our best hope.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things to watch, and it'll be interesting to see, certainly I am no prophet and I'm not son of a prophet, right? And I would barely, I'm not even really a historian. You have studied history, but I enjoy so much of reading of history, the reading of history, and sort of connecting these dots. But it's going to be interesting to see, can this American experiment continue? All the founders warned of becoming, a non-religious people, and an immoral people when you lose virtue. But what is inextricably linked to virtue and morality? It's religion, and so that's why education was so important. We're seeing it right now. It's turned towards indoctrination. Right now, we're looking for educational freedom, not just choice, but freedom and education. Can we really keep the spirit of 1776 alive without it? Is that possible?
Let me make a few comments. First of all, you're exactly right. Every American founder embraced what James Hudson of the Library of Congress called the founder syllogism, that a Republican form of government requires a moral people, and a moral people must be a religious people. And by that, they inevitably meant Christian in that context, right? And so, this is probably one of the first things you and I should do as Christians, is pray that those who do not know Christ will come to know Christ. And that would be the ideal step. Barring that happening, I think you're exactly right that we have to, or you suggested it, that we have to, in our schools, in our homes, teach these basic principles. I recently had the chance to do some consulting down in Florida, where they're putting together some wonderful civics education in the public schools, and teachers are getting endorsements and training and this sort of thing. And this is serious history, right? We aren't pretending that slavery didn't exist or that sort of thing. I would look at slavery and say this is a fundamental betrayal of the basic principles that America was based upon. We need to recognize that, but we also need to recognize that a lot of people, especially Christians, sacrificed a great deal to end that institution. And we've made great progress with respect to how African Americans are treated, for instance. So we need to teach these things, and we need to teach them as good things. As Frederick Douglass understood, right, the great African American abolitionist, this country is based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and this is a good thing. We should hold America up to these principles, and we certainly should teach them. So I think in the redder states, there's a lot of good educational reform being done. Perhaps in the bluer states, where they are doing a lot more indoctrination and critical race theory and that sort of thing, it becomes incumbent upon parents and private organizations to do some of the civics education, and of course to oppose the worst sorts of indoctrination that goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say finally, you have a book coming out in April of this next year. What's the book? What's coming out? Tell us a little bit about it real fast.
That actually fits real well with what we're talking about. The title is Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, How Christianity Has Advanced Liberty and Equality for All Americans. And so in a certain respect, I'm responding to the 1619 Project and other projects along those lines to say, look, Christianity has been singularly responsible for advancing liberty and equality for women, for all men, for ethnic minorities, to racial minorities, and so forth. So it's a provocative book. It's available on Amazon, and so one could pre-order it now if one desired.
Fantastic. Dr. Mark David Hall, thank you so much for joining the Give Me Liberty podcast.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Stick around, folks, for final thoughts right after this. Hey, thank you for watching the Give Me Liberty podcast. Really important conversation. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. One of the things that we need to understand is that there is no fear behind the word nationalism. You either have nations or you don't. You either have laws, sovereign nations with borders, boundaries, compacts, or you do not. Guess what? I live in a home. I own that home. That home belongs to me and my wife and to our kids, and we have rules in that home. Guess what? We lock our doors. We try to keep our home safe and secure. And all of the benefits and blessings in that home is shared among our family. And in a way, it's a microcosm of how we think about nations and nation states. I'm neighborly with all my neighbors on the street. I've got neighbors across the street. I respect their property. They respect mine. In a way, this is an example of what nationalism is really about. Yes, you can have liberal democracies. Yes, you can have leagues of nations that have a common understanding and work in common ways, multilateral agreements and all of that. They do not have to function unilaterally. At the end of the day, these are good, and what is necessary to civil society. So I hope you enjoy it. And by the way, you can't do this apart from the Word of God. Our nation was built on that common understanding. That foundation of our morality, our virtue, and our laws are all not just enshrined in our documents, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, but they're also found in the sacred scriptures. So invest in that as well. And we'll leave you with that. Until next time, God bless you.